Welcome back to another episode of Ask Your Pastors. Clay and I are back with a part two of our conversation on grief. So if you missed part one, we talked about how can we grieve well, and just began talking about grief during these holiday times, particularly when that's a really, grief is just very present for many of us at holidays because of losses that we've experienced. So in this conversation, we want to talk about the question, how can we help others who are grieving? Or maybe how can we not be helpful to others who are grieving? What are some things that we can tend to do that aren't helpful so that we don't do those things? I just want to have a conversation about that. So, uh, Clay, what have you what have you seen that has not been helpful? Or what are some things that we can do that aren't helpful to those who grieve that then maybe can lead us into talking about what are some things that are helpful?
Right. Well, I think you're the one that brought this up a minute ago. Is that sometimes we're afraid that we don't know what to say, and the reality is there's nothing to say. I mean, there's nothing
Yeah.
that we're going to say that's going to make sense out of a loss. Um, but we all sort of feel compelled to, I'm going to buy a card that says the best thing, or I just want I want to apply some salve. I want to apply Band-Aid. So when we don't have something to say, we just say nothing, and that's a disaster
Right.
because it just causes the other person to feel absolutely alone.
Right.
The second thing that uh, doesn't work very well is if we try to come up with an explanation.
Mm.
Now, whenever there's something that's too big for us to understand, our brain naturally goes into hyperdrive and we try to make sense out of it.
Right.
So we have a logic as if, and I think it's to help us feel like we have some control over things, but um, logic is not helpful. When we lost our first baby, and when when that happens to you, of course, in your brain, you're wondering maybe we'll never be able to have children. And not only is the loss of this one child, but also the future is questionable.
Yeah.
So when people offer you explanations on why, uh, the you didn't carry the baby full term, most of those explanations are not comforting because the thing your brain does with it is just, well, maybe that will happen again because there's no guarantee here. Maybe something will always be wrong with the baby that I'm carrying.
Yeah.
So that knowledge piece isn't really very helpful.
Yeah.
Our doctor told us there really isn't an explanation for miscarriages. That there's a few things that we've learned, but most of the time there's not a really good explanation. And that not knowing was really more helpful than some of the reasons that people gave us. Kitty was working at the time, and there were a couple older women who said to her, I was worried about you working so hard. And that was just like a knife in her heart
Mm.
because um, um, our doctor said there was no problem. The baby was safe. She could keep working and all that. And all of a sudden, the thought is, did I kill my child? Right? Now, the people who were offering that, they were just expressing what was their concern and love for her, but they weren't conscious of what her own brain was going to do with that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just to be able to express sorrow and sadness without an explanation is much healthier than
Yeah.
trying to come up with a reason for somebody.
Yeah. That's good. I think you're hitting there on something that we feel. We know, okay, I can be unhelpful with what I say. And I don't want to do that. And so we can then go to that place you mentioned where we just avoid the topic, or because we don't want to say something wrong, so we don't say anything, which isn't helpful. So what can we do when we want to love someone who's going through grief? What can we do? How do we enter into that with them?
Yeah, well, the most powerful thing we can do is to be with somebody. Just to take the time and say, I want to be with you. I want to sit with you. I want whatever you're doing, I'll do with you. We live in a culture where being busy is important. And when somebody stops being busy, the first thing you're going to think is, well, why are you here? You should be at work, or you should be doing this, or you should be doing that. And when you realize, oh, you're here because I'm important to you, or you're here because
Yeah.
the person who died was important to you.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, we don't have to have the answer.
No.
We don't have to. I think that can keep it. We feel like, well, I've got to have the answer. I've got to say something really helpful and really, and it takes some of the pressure off of us if we just recognize, I just get to enter in and say, I love you. I'm here for you. I'm praying for you.
Right.
I want to be with
Right.
you. Right.
And I think when we're believing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you want to tell your story?
Well, I'll tell mine, and then I want you to tell your story. So we'll swap stories here. Because
Okay.
I remember a time in college, Clay and I were sharing stories just before this. In college, my college roommate, who was also best friends with my best friend, we were all really close friends. And my college roommate, his girlfriend broke up with him. And that was devastating to him at the time. And I remember our mutual best friend, when he learned about that, he came over to our dorm room and he just sat in our dorm room through the evening. And my roommate didn't even acknowledge him being there. He was in his grief. He was hurt. He was angry. He didn't acknowledge it. That was okay. That didn't affect our friend. He just sat there. He wanted to be there. And I remember my roommate, when it came time for bed, he got ready for bed. He climbed up in his loft and went to bed. And our friend he still had his coat on, still had his day clothes on. He just laid down on our couch and he slept there through the night. And in the morning, my roommate got up, went off to class, didn't say anything. And my friend got up off the couch at that point and went on about his day. I don't know the effect that had on my roommate, but it had a huge effect on me to see our friend, how he loved my roommate through that. He just wanted to be there to let him know, you're not alone. I care about you. I'm not going to come in and try to fix it. I don't have the answer. I just want to be here because I care about you. That was a lesson for me in how to enter into somebody's. You just be with them. That was pretty powerful. You had a similar story in your guys when you lost your child, of just share that piece.
Yeah, so our baby was like a week under the government criteria at the time that required it required the baby to be given to a mortuary to his body to be dealt with. So we did a little private burial, and we had some friends of ours made this beautiful coffin out of wood. It was so touching to us, and to us it looked like a work of art. And so I go to the hospital to pick up my boy's body and put it in the coffin, and the Lord had been really present, with us, and I felt pretty strong. But when I put that little body in the coffin, it was too much. It was like I was overcome with darkness, really, like wondering, does God really exist? Is there nothing? Is this it? I mean, it was sort of a strange thing. Well, after I picked up my son, then I picked up a friend. As soon as my friend got in the car, he didn't say anything, but suddenly I could believe again. It's the same thing that happens to me sometimes when I'm particularly negative or despairing, and I'm just in a worship service with other believers, the water rises for me just by being in the presence of other believers. And my friend who was a believer caused light to come into my heart just by his being there. And that's why I think spiritual friendships are important, and that's a way that we can serve one another, because our presence uh, we remind each other the things that we know to be true.
Yeah, that's good. Maybe I could share one more story. We were talking about one of my professors, and these, I mean, this is turning in. We don't necessarily have the point like, here's how to be a good friend to somebody in grief. Point one, point two, point three, point. It requires a lot of wisdom and walking with God in the midst of praying for wisdom, and then just entering in and caring. I think that's kind of what we're landing on, is just caring, being present with people. I remember one of my professors at seminary. Um, he wrote a tribute to another professor that I had when he retired, and he talked about all the lessons he had learned from him, the truth that he had taught him. He was the other guy that was retiring was a brilliant, well-respected theologian and church historian. But this younger professor said, but the thing that impacted me the most was the time when we lost our child, and the doctors told us we would probably never be able to have children. And he said, this other professor was the first one at our home, and his wife were the first ones to be at our home. They came and they just sat with us, and they wept with us, and they hugged us. And they did that for hours. They were just with us in that. But then he said, and maybe if I could just read this, because I find it to be really, really powerful. He said, as they were leaving, though, he stopped at the door and spoke words I still hear. Russell, which is the younger professor's name, Russell, Romans 8:28 is often quoted at times like this, and rightly so. That's all things work together for good. He says, but I think you need to hear Romans 8:29. God has promised you something. He's promised to do whatever it takes to conform you into the image of Christ, so he might be the firstborn among many brothers. I don't know why this is happening to you and your wife. It's awful. I can't tell you the reason God's permitting you to walk this path, and I can't tell you exactly where he's taking you in it. But I do know this. God is committed to shaping you into the image of Jesus, and that's for your good. He hasn't forgotten you, and he hasn't forsaken you. Now, the younger professor who he was speaking these words to said in the tribute, he said, I doubt I would have heard those words if they'd come before the tears and the silence. But because they came after those things, I heard them with my whole heart. And then he goes on to just describe how powerful that truth was, that it anchored him and carried him through his grief. And so when I think of grief and think about entering into grief with somebody, I always think of that story, because I think it communicates that thing, Clay, that you're talking about, the sense of, I just want to be with you. I'm not here to preach to you. I'm not here to fix it. I'm not here to explain it. I'm just here to weep with you. And as you're feeling the pain of this shouldn't be this way, that's right. That's good. Because of the fall, things are broken, and it's right that you cry out and feel this pain. It shouldn't be this way. And he was just with him in that. But there was also the other side of it. And I think it probably wisdom, discernment, the Spirit's leading, however that plays out. He did speak into the midst of it. He spoke comforting truth that wasn't heavy-handed, wasn't trying to explain. It was just bringing in a promise from God to be something to bring a little bit of hope into the midst of the situation. God has not forsaken you. God is with you in this. And that meant the world. Those two things together meant the world to this guy as he was going through grief. And I think as believers, we get to do that. We get to grieve and weep and enter into pain with people, and we get to be hope, like your friend was hope to you just by being there. And sometimes that will mean speaking truth to help our friends, to help those we love grieve, but not as those who have no hope, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story.
Yeah. So
So let's talk a minute about the holiday season and how to help people who we know who are in the middle of grief.
yeah,
Uh, what can we do? And I think the biggest thing we can do is to ask them how they're doing, but not in some generic way that we're all very capable of dodging by saying, "Oh, I'm doing fine," but to ask some pointed questions like, um, "Are you thinking about so and so a lot these days? Um, is this year any easier than last year, or is it the same? Have you found um, your grief, the way you're grieving, has it changed over the last several months?" But you're just opening the door to let this person know that, number one, you love them.
yeah,
Number two, you're not afraid to hear, even if it's kind of messy.
yeah,
And that it's okay. It's okay to talk rather than they just have to bottle it up like it's not
right,
really there. So yeah, ask the question. Don't be afraid of the questions, and then really listen.
yeah,
And then if you when the person's done, when to just lay your hand on them and pray, whether the other person's a believer or not. This is a very powerful thing. Just
mm,
say, "Hey, I just if I just for comfort for you, what a blessing we can be." And it's just taking the time and giving space
yeah.
for where they really are. And it's a great thing to do.
That's really good. That's helpful counsel, I think, for us to help us love others this holiday season who are experiencing. Um, Clay, maybe we could wrap it up this way. We were talking before we started recording the video about Romans 8 and the idea that um, all of creation is groaning because of the fall and the brokenness, the loss we all experience. That right sense of this is not how it should be. That's a good and a right response to pain, to grief, to loss. And Romans 8 brings us into that since all of creation is groaning and we ourselves groan, longing for the restoration of all things. And then it talks about how we groan, but we groan with hope because we have these promises that God is going to restore and make all things new. So I think both for those who are grieving and for those of us who get to walk alongside those who grieve, just keeping that big storyline in view of what God is doing, that He is the one who entered into our world of grief to begin undoing it. That's a
Yes.
powerful truth. His presence with us in our grief. He came into the world to share our sorrows, to bear our griefs, Isaiah says, and to undo them. Um, so, so I'm just there's no question there. Let me throw that back to you for a second. Do you have any thoughts, any comments on that? And then I'll close with a J.R. Tolkien quote that's one of my favorites, maybe.
Yeah, I just think it's good to remember that things are not as they're meant to be, which is why we experience so much pain.
Yeah,
Um, and and I think then to refocus a little bit that Christmas isn't just about um, Santa Claus, but it's about the desperate state that we're all in, and God is doing something about it,
yeah. Christ
giving
came
us
into the
hope
midst of it.
in the midst of darkness.
Yeah, yeah,
So there should be space in our lives for um, those who find themselves in darkness at this time. We need to not be afraid to enter into that,
yeah,
to give them a hand,
yeah.
give them some comfort. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, It's good. So here's my quote. We'll close with this. So there's a scene in the Lord of the Rings where it was thought that Gandalf had died. He had been drugged down to the underworld, and they thought he was dead, and all hope was lost. But then he came back, and Samwise Gamgee says, Gandalf, is everything sad going to come untrue? And I love that statement because that's what Jesus tells us. Behold, I'm making all things new. Everything sad is going to come untrue. And this is the hope we have in our grief. That doesn't smooth over the grief, but it is the hope that we have in the midst of it, that one day he will undo even this and take this and make it into something more beautiful. Everything sad will come untrue. That's our hope because of Christmas, because Jesus came into our pain to undo it. So I hope these conversations have been helpful to you who are listening, whether you're grieving or whether you know someone in grief. Let's be praying for one another this season and look for ways to love one another and walk alongside one another. And we will see you on our next Ask Your Pastors. So until then, God bless. Bye-bye.